Thank you. Joanne.
I guess I need to unmute. Okay, so this has been a great series talking about Asian religions. When I first saw it, my reaction was, these are the Asian religions by the books, but they don't seem to have a lot to do with what I've actually seen in Asia. And so I sort of jumped in and thought, well, can I figure out what it's like, what it's been like for people in China, speaking of China, because that's where most of my experience is, and how that relates to what we've been hearing. So this is going to be more of an historical approach, and talking also trying to how to see how things fit together. So what I hope to discuss is how the West came to see China as a field with three distinct religious philosophical traditions. And then the cosmology or worldview that I think underlies the Chinese philosophical teachings that helps to unify them. What this means for how Chinese people have seen themselves in their place in the religious world, and how that enables them to embrace religious diversity, because that's something that we think is kind of strange, that people can belong to more than one religion at a time. I think Chinese religion really stretches our ideas of what religion is. So what constitutes religion? How is religion different from philosophy? How is religion different from superstition? So it's kind of an alternate universe from Europe and the West. And both Chinese and Western folks have said at various times that the Chinese are the least religious people in the world. And I think that's because there's a big gap between Chinese philosophy and religion as it's actually practiced. When I was in school, graduate school, I studied Chinese philosophy, but really not very much on religion. So, got a couple of quotes here. Liang Qichao was, in the first decade of the 20th century, the most prominent Confucian philosopher, journalist, revolutionary, bridge between East and West around. He was a very prominent person. And he said at that time, since there is no religion among the indigenous products of China, what makes up the Chinese history of religion are mainly the religions introduced from foreign lands. The Zen school of Buddhism is a Chinese product, but it belongs more suitably to philosophy than to religion. Taoism is the only religion indigenous to China, but to include it in a Chinese history of religion is indeed a great humiliation. And then a generation later, Hu Shi, who was a scholar and a Nobel-nominated essayist, a Cornell University graduate, a language reformer. He was one of those who helped to try to define what 20th century modern Chinese language, written language, should be. He was an educational reformer and theorist, and he was ambassador to the US in around 1940. He said, the educated people in China are indifferent to religion. And he also said, China is a country without religion, and the Chinese are a people who are not bound by religious superstitions. So there are a couple of 20th century viewpoints from people who, with a primarily Confucian background, I would say. It's interesting that the Chinese Constitution, the present Chinese Constitution, protects freedom of religion. It protects freedom of religion for Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. I would say not religious practice, but religious thought is theoretically protected under the Chinese Constitution. And by the way, Catholicism and Protestantism have been seen in Asia as two separate religions. And that's because, of course, the Jesuits brought Catholicism to China early on. They called it in Chinese, it's the religion of the Lord of Heaven. And then along about the Great Awakening, the Protestant missionaries arrived and they said, this is the religion of Jesus. So that's the Jesus religion. So they're separate. But temples are all over, or were all over China. And even today, when you travel, in places, most of them have been torn down or used for other purposes, but some of them are preserved as tourist sites. So lots and lots of temples all over China. So there were religions, what gives? So there's lots of religious diversity in China. And then the first question is what unifies it, I suppose. So my proposal would be to start very early on at the beginning and try to explain what the cosmology or the worldview of the Chinese was and how that underlies these other things. Have you all heard of the Ijing? Or maybe you've heard of it as the Ijing. That's one of the oldest books in China. And I understand it is a bestseller in the US. It sells many more copies than the Analects or any other religious books from China. It's gotten quite a following, I guess, in the West. It was supposed to have been written by the ancient sages that Confucius looked back to. The ones that he said the ideal rulers of the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. And then it was said that Confucius wrote commentaries himself to the Ijing. And originally it was organized around gua or hexagrams, which are interestingly 6-digit binary barcodes. And you may have seen these. If I can do this, yeah. You see some that like that with solid lines, some like that with broken lines, and a mixture. So these really are 6-digit binary barcodes. And by the way, Leibniz was fascinated by this. He was corresponding to with the Jesuits when they were in China in the 16th and 17th century. And he said, wow, the Chinese invented binary numbers. They're never used as numbers, but they're used as codes for divination. So the Ijing is organized into 64 chapters or whatever around these. You get 64 digits out of six digits. I mean, you get 64 numbers out of 6 digits. And the first one that's all solid, that's all said to be yang. And the solid lines are all yang. The broken lines are all yin. So the first gua in the Ijing is the solid lines. The second one is all yin. And then, all of the rest of them proceed from there in various combinations. So people would, and divination is one of the earliest things we know about China. The earliest Chinese writing that anybody has ever found were written on the scapula of oxen and maybe some other animals. And what they would do, they would write a message on the bone, and then they would heat the bone to until cracks formed on the bone, and then they would read the cracks to answer. The message on the bone would be, I'm thinking of going to war tomorrow. Is that a good idea? Something like that. And from the cracks in the bone, they would read the answer. Oh, this is a very bad idea. Or yes, tomorrow's a good day for war, or whatever. And it's very odd that I think that we get this as the earliest Chinese writing of all. It's very different from what you see as the earliest writing in other cultures. And it makes me think that probably writing was around for a long time before that, but the media that things were written on just haven't survived. But anyway, so divination, getting answers to questions of what should we do from the gods has been around since the beginnings that we know of Chinese civilization. And the Ijing was a different way of doing it. Actually, there are two ways of reading the title of the Ijing, and one is the classic of changes. That's the way it's usually translated. But the E in Ijing also means easy. So this could be the easier classic of divination. It's easier than heating up those bones. Anyway, the way people would do this is they would have a kind of a coin toss of some sort and do 6 different tosses and write down what the answer was in each of them, and then look up in the book what the answer to their question was. Whatever I was trying to do, was that a good idea or not? But there's another way of reading the Ijing, and people have done that, started doing that around the time of Confucius. And that's to read it as the cosmology. This is how the world begins. And so the first gua is the 1. The second one is the 2. The 1 bifurcates, becomes the 2. Then you have yin and yang, and the yin and yang, they exchange qi. And qi is the breath or the substance or the matter energy of the universe. So this is the creation story. That's how it's been interpreted. And this is repeated, of course, in the Tao Te Ching. So in this creation story, the universe is uncreated. And the Chinese have pointed out, this is like the Big Bang. You know, something happens, we don't know why, something happens, but suddenly there is the universe. Now, there are other Chinese creation myths, and I kind of went to look those up a little bit. And it seems that creation myths with creators, some of them may be very ancient because there were more than one place. You know, China was a large place and coming together from smaller cultures in different places. But a lot of those creation myths seem to date from later than this time. They may have been things that people made up because it wasn't very satisfying to get this kind of Big Bang theory. So anyway, from this cosmology, there were kind of 2 approaches that emerged. The Confucian approach incorporated the Zhou religion of the time. And the religion of the time, which was the official religion of the state, and this is a theme that goes all the way through Chinese history. The highest god, highest deity or entity, whatever there was something called Tian, which is the Chinese word for heaven. And then there were gods of the sun, moon, stars, mountains and rivers, and agricultural gods. So this was the state religion, kind of like the Roman religion, but there were 2 major differences. And the first one, I think, is that these gods had no personalities. They were not like those ribald Roman gods that were always getting into trouble and causing trouble for each other and for humans and so forth. And the second difference is that the Romans wanted everybody to worship their gods. I guess they required it, right? The Chinese state forbade anyone from worshiping the gods except the emperor. If you worshiped these gods, then you were stepping out of line. You had to go through channels. So this view said that the universe is governed by fate, an uncreated universe, where things happen because of energy systems that nobody controls. The universe is governed by fate, but it could be affected by virtue. And this would be principally the virtue of the ruler, because the ruler was the most powerful human. And there became an idea about statecraft that said, if an emperor, it's really, of course, a religious justification for what happens. Somebody wins a war, becomes an emperor, and the mandate of heaven said he's emperor because he's virtuous and he deserves to be emperor, and heaven, or Tian, wants him to be emperor. But then there are things that happen because not everything goes smoothly. And there's portents. If there are eclipses or strange storms, things, unexplained phenomena, these are warnings that the ruler's not doing something right. And if there are major floods and other major disasters, then the ruler is in danger of losing heaven's mandate. So again, this is just a justification in religion for what actually happens on the ground. But this was how it was seen. The Zhou dynasty religion also incorporated ancestor worship, and that seems to have been a very big part of Confucianism then. And the state was modeled on the family. So there's one of the Confucian classics, the Great Learning, or the Daxia, or the Great Learning, is very explicit about this. It's very, very short. It has kind of an 8-step progression where it says if the ruler wants to know how to do things, he goes down and he wants to make sure that things are done well. He goes down and he makes sure that people regulate their families properly. And to regulate the families properly, they have to get their minds in order. Once the people have their minds in order and everybody's head is clear and they're doing the right things, then the fathers can regulate their families properly, and then the state can, and the families will be good, and it goes back up, and the state will be well regulated. So the state really is modeled on the family in Confucianism. So one question at this point is, as a religion, where does this leave the people? Does it provide anybody with any sense of comfort or control or anything? It seems to be just thoroughly built for the state. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything, but. So anyway, this is
Well, Joanne,
yes.
Sorry, it took me a moment to unmute, but it is resonating with me in that it's not that different from how Christianity operated prior to the Reformation. That the religious structure of Roman Catholicism was really all from the Pope and down to the priests, and they all interacted with the state, and they helped keep the rulers of the folks in line. And the actual like, worship, the actual people, below the level of the priest, really were not that involved. And it was, the Reformation came along and we had the priesthood of believers and the Calvinist work ethic and all of that, that Calvin in particular said, that actual everyday Christians need to be Christians every day and be a part of the process. But prior to that, it was very top down, and the priest dispensed what he dispensed to his parish. And, but it sounds very much like what you're describing to me.
I think you're right.
When you were speaking, Joanne, I was thinking too, that what you were describing made me think of what I think is sort of a European thing, the divine right of kings.
Right.
That's very much what it sounded like. And that leads to into what Dan was talking about.
Right.
A lot of these things that we have visited and at least superficially touched upon make me think of, oh, that's just very similar to the way Christianity believes this, or the way Christianity does that. So, it, to me, just all leads back to there are many ways to believe and many ways to worship, and they're more alike than I used to think anyway.
Maybe in this case, this is how power works.
Right.
Right.
Across everywhere.
Yes.
So anyway, as Scott pointed out earlier, this was arising at a time of division in China, and there were civil wars going on, and the civil wars from Confucius's time for the next 300 years only got worse. Everything kept getting worse, and there were many schools of thought about how to deal with this problem.
Hey, Joanne, what era, what kind of time frame are we talking about?
Confucian was about 500 BCE.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the time of Isaiah and the prophets.
Yeah, this is the axial age, really. People have called it, right? So there's thought spilling up from these kinds of things all over the place. So this kind of stuff just kept getting worse in China until in 221 BC. Then you have the first emperor of the Qin Shi Huangdi. And you may have heard of this guy, the Terracotta Warriors guy.
Oh,
He
yes.
unified China. He unified pieces of the Great Wall. He did some useful things. He standardized weights and measures and things like that helped to unify the country. But it was a very, very oppressive system with forced labor and work on these big projects. And he also said, we will have one system of thought. And that system of thought would be another school that was around the time between Confucius and this time. They've been called in the West the legalists. And they said, unlike Confucianism, they said, man's nature is bad. He must be kept in line by harsh laws. So this was the system that governed the Qin state. And it got so bad there that it only lasted about 16 years. And then as soon as the emperor died, China was plunged into civil war again. Oh, yes. And did I say he said, except for that one school, we have to burn the books of all the others. No other schools of thought are allowed to exist. So there's a lot that's been lost from the pre-Qin period, and we really don't know how much that was. But so the next group that came in, you had a peasant rebellion, and the peasant ultimately became emperor. And this began the first really great dynasty in China, which lasted from approximately 200 BCE to 200 BC. I mean, CE, you call it nowadays, yes, not AD anymore. So it was almost 400 years with a little bit of a break in the middle. And at that point, they said the Qin experience was so awful. We got to do something different. And that's when they made Confucianism again. That's when they made Confucianism the state doctrine. They said it doesn't work to use just harsh punishments, although we will do that. But we need something else. We need to educate people, and we need to try to get people to behave by agreement, not just by punishing them. So with this new dynasty, there was another intellectual ferment. And this kind of Confucianism then with these legalist elements became the state religion. And there was another theory about that. There's about the centrality of the emperor to peace and organization and so forth, and also to heaven, earth, and man. So you have here the characters for, let's see if I can see what I'm, up here, not there. There's a character for heaven. You can see the line up on the top. There's the character for earth. You put those together with a vertical line through them. And the idea is you've got heaven, earth, and man in the middle. And the vertical line is the king. It's the job of the king to hold all this together. And that, by the way, is the Chinese character for king. So, the state ideology that developed quite a bit here. You had this original cosmology with yin yang and the qi, and now there was a new idea. There's the 5 element theory. Do you remember when Beth said that there were 5 elements that went through in a fixed pattern? She didn't begin to talk about all the 5s. 5 turns out to be kind of a magic number. So you take the 5 directions, even though there are probably only 4. You have 5 directions and 1 in the center. You take the 5 seasons. Well, okay, you need to add 1 there too, because 5 is a magic number. And there's a huge long list of how these things work. And that became a new part of this synthesis. So in addition to yin yang, all of these things, all these cycles of 5 are constantly cycling through and creating changes in the universe that somehow or other we have to figure out how to understand and control. There is, by the way, Chinese love numbers, and there's all kinds of numerology. So there are lots of things where you listen to the Chinese government and they'll say, we have the 3 thises and the 4 that's, and all of that kind of thing. And there's even more fun stuff. If you want to have some fun with it, look up, Google Chinese numerology and find out all the things that people do with numbers. For example, one way of saying that somebody's playing with less than a full deck is that they are a 250. Yeah, the idea may be, nobody knows for sure, that copper coins used to come in strings of 1,000. So if you've only got 250, then you're definitely not playing with a full deck. So there's this kind of thing.
One of the early church quote unquote fathers suggested there should be 4 gospels because there were 4 winds and 4 directions on the compass. So how we got a Trinity then, I don't know.
Yeah,
That goes back to about the year 400. So that's interesting.
yeah. I mean, I think 7 and 12 are magic numbers in the West. Yeah. So, you know, we all have this kind of thing. So once again, if you're operating in a universe where there's nobody in charge, except to the extent that that the ruler or, you know, other virtuous people can somehow bring about some kind of order. What does that do to how do people feel? How do the people react to the insecurity of it? And I think about this in terms of what happened when in the West, when Calvin preached predestination, right? And so what came out of that, I think, if you listen to Max Weber, is basically the prosperity gospel. You know, you want to know, am I okay? Well, if I'm wealthy and then, you know, seemingly doing well on earth, then I must be okay. I must be one of the elect, and or could be the other way around. So I think there was some of the same kind of thing going on here. So in China, there was a lot of divination, a lot of kind of various kinds of shamanism to try to figure out how things work. And people were playing with numbers in various ways, and there were formulas for all kinds of things. You see this today with the Chinese zodiac and what people say. And by the way, if you think this kind of thing is no longer, if you think it's dead, consider this. In China, you remember the 2008 Summer Olympics. 8 is a very positive number. It's a homonym with development, in some dialects with wealth and so forth. So the opening ceremony of the Olympics, the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, began on August 8th, 2008 at 8 minutes and 8 seconds past 8 p.m. local time, which just happened to be Greenwich Mean Time plus 8 hours. So there you are. They timed it to the second. So in this period, and we're talking contemporaneous with the Roman Empire now, these 100 schools of thought were essentially winnowed down nominally to 2, Confucianism and Taoism. And the Confucian school came to include ideas of statecraft that had been part of another school, other schools, such as Moism. There was one where this was about everybody should live simple lives and practice universal love. And then the legalism that I talked about, that was incorporated into the state religion and the cult of heaven and so forth. And Taoism, and this was a new term around this time. It didn't have that name back when Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi were doing their writing. Came to include such traditions that had not been associated with it necessarily, such traditions as medicine, the Yellow Emperor medical tradition, internal alchemy or breath control techniques, and other life extending and immortality seeking techniques. I think there were some emperors who may have been killed off by ingesting cinnabar, which was considered rather a magical life extending substance at that point. Plus the schools of Lao Tzu, Ijing, and I don't know if we've mentioned the other classic that was the same time as Lao Tzu was the Zhuangzi, and he was another Taoist philosopher, contemporaneous or slightly after Lao Tzu and Confucius. So then around the 1st century CE, suddenly you begin to get what they call religious Taoism. Now there probably were folk religions before that, but we don't know anything about them. But around the 1st century, there was what was called religious Taoism. And people have said in times of chaos, which the 1st century, 2nd century especially, was gradually becoming, new religions tend to be born then. So this new religion sort of added to the official gods, all kinds of folk gods that bubbled up from everywhere. We don't know where they came from, but there was a huge variety of them. And around the same time, Buddhism arrived. And this is interesting. I know, from my study of Buddhism comes from the same sources that you have been looking at. I had a class on it in college and so forth. From the Chinese side, I have studied zilch on Buddhism, because in Chinese studies and Chinese history, Buddhism is a field all to itself, and its vocabulary is utterly not understandable to anybody who doesn't study it specifically. And a big part of the problem is the Chinese language. You know, because there is no alphabetic script, no phonetic script in Chinese, foreign ideas come in with difficulty. So what happened when first Buddhist missionaries came into China from elsewhere, and then later Chinese Buddhists went to India to get the sutras, they had to find a language to discuss, to write about all of this huge Buddhist literature that existed from India. And the only way they could do it was to take the Indian terminology and use Taoist terminology to describe it. So Buddhism came into China with a heavy overlay of Taoist terminology, which no doubt really changed it around and messed up some of the original meanings. So there are lots of big filters here. One big filter is when the Chinese first encountered Buddhism, they had no idea that there were different schools of Buddhism in India. They didn't know that what they were encountering was not a unified doctrine. And then you filter it through Taoist terminology, and as I say, it becomes something that nobody understands unless you spend your life studying it. So I know very little about it, nothing, pretty much. But some of the things about Buddhism had to change in order to work in the Chinese context. One is that the Chinese were not going to put up with itinerant monks begging all the time. They just weren't. So monasteries had to acquire their own land and become self-sufficient. The Chinese disliked badly the idea of the monks shaving their heads. There is a line in the classic of filial piety that says, "Your body, hair, and skin are a gift from your parents, and you dare not destroy them." And that meant typically that traditional Chinese did not cut their hair or their beards, because that would be not showing gratitude toward their parents. So men would tie their hair up on their tops of their heads and so forth. This was an issue for Buddhism when they came in, and the monks and nuns were supposed to shave their heads. And then these monasteries started acquiring land. Monasteries and nunneries started acquiring land And that was taking resources away from the state. Also, the idea of leaving your family and becoming a monk or something was kind of went against Confucianism. So there was a long period in here from about the 2nd century CE up until about the year 1000, when Buddhism was quite strong in China. But there were periodic persecutions, and there were major persecutions in the 8th and 9th centuries and after. And so it began to decline after that period. And then about the year 1000, there was a new form of Confucianism that started to draw in Buddhist and Taoist ideas into a new Confucian synthesis. It was called Neo-Confucianism. And at that point, this was the Song dynasty now. We've gone through a period of disunion. We've gone through the Tang dynasty, which was heavily influenced by Buddhism. And in the Song dynasty and on after that, Confucianism is back on the upswing. And the Song dynasty instituted the civil service examination system, which was based entirely on the Confucian classics. So from this point on, Confucianism is really the top dog religion in China. So several of these Song scholars went back to the classics. They redefined the classics. They brought ideas from Buddhist and Taoist. They brought Buddhist and Taoist meditation practices to some degree into Confucianism. They updated the cosmological synthesis into a new synthesis. And so from then on, all educated Chinese are Confucians, because that's the basis of the education system. So you might be interested in reading the Taoist classics, and you might take interest personally in Buddhist ideas, but fundamentally, you're going to be a Confucian. So Buddhism was seriously weakened as a result of this. And what I've been reading says that the state put very severe restrictions on the number of Buddhist monks that there could be. So, and the quota really did not rise from about the 10th century on up to the 18th century or the 19th century. So there were fewer and fewer Buddhist monks and so forth around compared with the population. I think there may have been some exceptions to the kind of dying out of Buddhism. I suspect that it had something of a resurgence. I don't know this, I haven't studied it, but I suspect it might have had a bit of a resurgence under the Mongols, because the Mongols were encouraging to all religions. And there was, there were Christians, there were Muslims, there were all kinds of Central Asian interesting things coming in the Mongol period, but that was only about a century. I thought there might have been one or two monasteries that remained relatively prosperous. One of them that I looked up just out of curiosity because of its history with martial arts was the Shaolin Temple. And from what I understood when I looked that up, it's a little hard to get information about that, by the way, because you have all the martial arts enthusiasts, and I don't necessarily trust the information. But from what I read, the Shaolin Temple built connections with the Ming state. So, because I thought they might have been on the outs with the imperial household being armed monks, they would be dangerous, but apparently they had some kind of close connection with the state. And in addition to that, Buddhism was very often involved in or central to anti-government millenarian movements, which happened constantly. well, not constantly, they happen with great regularity, once every century, or sometimes more, or sometimes less. But Buddhism was, for that reason, and because of the centrality of Confucianism, was really weakened as a separate religion after the Song onward. So there's this synthesis now, and the question is how it all fit together. And so it seemed that Confucian ethics were central. They were taught by the family. They were taught by state proclamations. The state officials, the government was run by civil officials down to the county level, and these county magistrates were required to read off documents about Confucian ethics annually and so forth. So they were taught by that kind of thing, and they were taught primarily, I would say, by the needs of the examination system, because everybody had to understand the Confucian classics for that. And anybody who had any ambition at all wanted to take the exams. This kind of Confucianism was hierarchical, it was authoritarian, it was very patriarchal. There were ideal Confucians. They were kind of secular saints along the way, and they're part of the culture. Very early, and they tended to be officials who stood up to emperors when things were bad. There was a man named Qu Yuan, who was very early on in Chinese history. He's the one that the Dragon Boat Festival is about. He told it was not a unified empire at that time, but he told his ruler, you need to do thus and such, and the ruler said no, and somebody else said, you got to get rid of this guy, he's troublesome, and so they exiled him. He wrote some beautiful poetry, and then he committed suicide by jumping in the river. So the Dragon Boat Festival, you have these donzi, this bamboo wrapped rice packets, and the dragon boat races, and it's all built around, well, people went out in their boats and they dropped these rice packets into the water so that the fish wouldn't eat Qu Yuan, and we're trying to save his life. So he's one of these Confucian kind of saints, and there are several of these. Then Taoism. Well, Taoism really had no full ethical system and no means for promoting one. And I can't think of any Taoist saints. Taoism at this point, except for the classics that were preserved and still read, was primarily a folk religion. And then Buddhism was, as I said, either sidelined or sometimes anti-state, but mostly it tried to accommodate Chinese values. So there's a quote that I read from the book by, as I mentioned her once before, a classmate of mine who studied Chinese religion. And I don't know what era this comes from, but he writes, this is a Buddhist monk, he writes, "The filial heart is the true bodhisattva. Filial conduct is the great arena of the Tao. If we practice filial piety toward our aged parents, this is the equivalent of opening and reading the sutras all day long. If we wish to emulate the upright characteristics of the Buddha, then there is nothing that can surpass filial piety." So all of this is pulled together. A little bit on some of the other Buddhist, ethics. Serious Chinese, as I understand it, serious Chinese and Vietnamese Buddhists avoid meat and onion family vegetables. But that's not true of others. I learned when I was on my trip in India and Bhutan on this was a Buddhist trip 4 years ago. Our leader said that the Chinese are a little bit unusual among all Buddhists in that more Chinese Buddhists do stay away from meat. The Tibetans, on the other hand, depend on animals in their environment, so they do eat meat. And the Dalai Lama says, well, you should avoid meat if it's possible, but it's difficult, I know. And in Japan, where Buddhism took root and stayed much longer up to the present, the 7th century emperor prohibited the eating of the meat of four-legged animals and of roosters in the 7th century. And so the Japanese did not eat meat, presumably. They did eat fish. And what came out of that was there has been, and the Japanese have been fighting against this since in the last 100 years, but there was a subclass of, you would say, untouchables in Japan whose jobs were either butchering or leather tanning. And because these are people not practicing right livelihood from the Eightfold Path, then they have been a subclass that are very much persecuted. And so the Meiji Emperor in the 19th century lifted the ban, and guess what? All of a sudden you get sukiyaki, which no Japanese ate before that. So it was a new dish. Anyway, Buddhist sects in Japan apparently differ about whether they eat meat. Some do, some don't. I'm running out of time. There's a little bit about, since religion has to do a lot with the afterlife, a little bit about funeral practices and so forth. The Confucian classics don't discuss the soul, but the general idea in China, I guess, has been that the soul has 2, sometimes even 3 parts. There's a lighter spiritual soul that rises to heaven when you die, and a heavier earthly soul that is buried with the body. So funeral practices relate to settling these souls in the right place. And so a lot of the practices have to do with, providing food for the dead, for their journey into the afterlife, and sometimes money and burning money and so forth. And then feng shui is about settling the earthly soul. So you need to site the grave in the proper place so that the chi of the landscape gives it a good life in the earthly soul. So this was part of that original Chinese notion that is still practiced to some degree. And then sociologists have said about the Chinese spirit world, which is heavily populated, that there are 3 categories of spirits. There are gods, there are ghosts, and ancestors. And the gods tended to be the Confucian gods, that started with the original religion, or a lot of times they would be extraordinary individuals. Somebody who was known as an incorrupt official, a great warrior, somebody like that, would become a god, either because he was worshipped popularly, or because the state would say, okay, I see this is useful, so we appoint this person, the spirit of this person, to be an official in the spirit world. And the state was allowed to do that. So you had these gods that were, and some of these came from Buddhism, some of them came from popular Taoism, some of them came from state Confucianism. There's a huge intermixture of all of this. Ghosts were dangerous spirits to be avoided. And ghosts tended to be to happen when somebody died, when there was no one to take care of their spirit. So these hungry ghosts hung around and were not sent off properly into the spirit world. And they became dangerous. Everybody wanted to avoid them. And that's part of the ancestor thing. You need to take care of your ancestors in order that they do good things for you and not become problems for the community. And it's not clear that heaven was a separate place. This word heaven, some people have said, is a mistranslation. This whole spirit world engulfs us. It's not really necessarily separate. So I was becoming interested in how this works with Buddhism. So I tried to look up, how does it fit? I mean, Buddhism says you have no soul, but you have transmigration. So you get reincarnation in a different body. And that doesn't seem to fit. If you die, something, not a soul, but something is reborn in a different body that is presumably unrelated to you and unconnected. On the other hand, if you're a Confucianist, your soul becomes an ancestor, and that soul, you would sort of minister to and keep close through sacrifices. So the one doesn't seem to fit the other. Although when I asked my Chinese friends, they said, well, I don't see the problem, But one suggestion I read was that, well, it's possible that rebirth doesn't happen until the ancestor has actually been forgotten by all living descendants. So the other little thing here is that cults that promised salvation were outlawed because they were a danger to the state. And you can see this in peasant rebellions all along through time. But the most recent one, and this becomes relevant now, is Falun Gong. Have you heard about Falun Gong? Falun Gong is a cult that came up that was born in, I don't know what decade, it might have been the 70s or 80s in China, current contemporary China. And it was a practice that was about Qigong. It was related to Buddhism, and it was related to Qigong. What Qigong is exercises. It's Qi exercises. It's like Tai Chi, but it's very specifically designed to move your Qi in specific ways. So people would get together and do Qigong together. Well, the Chinese state decided that this was a dangerous cult, and they outlawed it. And they have cracked down on it very harshly. There are allegations that people were put in prison and then their organs were harvested for whatever. Anyway, it's been very severely cracked down upon. And so it has moved abroad. Has anybody heard of Shenyang? It should be playing at maybe, what's the name of the Civic Theater now? I mean the downtown soon. Shenyang comes to Portland every year. It's a Chinese acrobatic musical thing. This is put out. It is beautiful, by the way. And they say we're preserving traditional culture, but this is put out by the Falun Gong Society in New York. And if you go to it, you will get a sermon or a proselytizing in the intermission. So this is the most recent of these kind of illegal religious societies that have come up. And people have said, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you persecute people for doing Qigong? And I think the main reason for that would be because the founder of the group is still alive and therefore exerts power over his followers. So it's dangerous. Anyway, that's most of what I had to say. The thing to know is, if you think about China and Europe, not only is it a different type of religion because it's polytheistic here in popular forms, but there was almost no clergy. There were no institutional foundations, almost no institutional foundations. People would get their religious education from popular tales. There was nothing like the European church to say, this is doctrine, this is not. There was only the state and the state religion. So, talk too much? Questions? Yeah.
Joanne, I'm not going to say this correctly. What is the definition of divination?
Oh, divination?
Okay, spell it for me, please.
Divination.
Okay.
It's fortune telling.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Did you mention where the Chinese New Year celebrations fit in?
Oh, yeah. If you go back to the Han synthesis that I talked about, that's when they came up with the Chinese calendar. The Chinese calendar is based on a cycle of 60. There are the 10 heavenly stems. That is one through 10, and there are the characters for these. If you make a list in English, you say A, this, B, that, C, that. In Chinese, you say you go down the 10 heavenly stems: Jia, Yi, Bing, Ding. So there are those, and I think that corresponds to the 10 days of the Chinese week. The Chinese months were divided into 3 weeks of 10 days. So then you have the 10 heavenly stems, you have the 12 earthly branches, and those are the 12 months. And so this cycle of 60 is where you get the 12 earthly branches, of course, correspond to the animals of the zodiac. You put them together, you get cycles of 60 days within the year and 60 years. And then you have months, extra months thrown in to make it catch up. But did that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting, Joanne. It was like, a lot of material, but it's, just a different view on kind of how it fits together.
Yeah, and I look at this and I'm thinking, I think my friend Judy Burling had it well. She said she called her book "A Pilgrim in Chinese Culture," and she was trying to understand this from a Chinese point of view without being, and also to speak about, we in the West need to understand how to deal with religious diversity. The Chinese know how to do this. They've been doing this for a long time. So let me understand them from that point of view. But to listen to what the people I quoted at the beginning, educated Chinese saying, the great mass of the people have this disgusting, superstitious religion that we want nothing to do with, is a bit, it's a bit like us to some degree saying, those Christians who just don't get it and who make the state religion, the US state religion, and the personal relationship with God and all this kind of stuff, they don't get it either. And, you know, this sense of the other as being wrong, we have as well as they do. So.
Oh, yeah.
One of the threads that keeps coming up over and over again in all these religious discussions that fascinates me is the kind of how people become divine or become sainted.
Yeah.
After, I mean, the Romans, you know, turned their emperors into gods. But then they built temples to them and sort of worshipped them as dead emperors. And as soon as the emperors got a hold of Christianity, first thing they did is built, you know, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so that they had a place to worship the dead Jesus. But you know, but then there's some of that flows into Christianity, where Christianity starts making saints out of people that are really, you know, extra special good. And it's one of the aspects of Christianity that has absolutely no basis in the Bible
Yeah,
at all.
I thought that was very parallel with this Chinese stuff. Yeah.
Well, I think what's really different is the regard for the family, and you know what you were describing, that about the highest moral behavior you can have is to revere your parents and your ancestors and that kind of thing. And that's to me, that seems different than what Western Christianity has embraced.
Mhm.
And that does get into maybe even where Scott started the series, and he talked a little bit about community and you know, that kind of a view versus the individualistic view versus more of an inner view. Anyway,
I would say that among the things I learned tonight that I had no idea about was the idea of the rebirth doesn't happen until all the living ancestors forget the person.
Well, that's only one theory. I don't know if that's true, but
but I love it. I'm going to grab it and run with it. But I mean,
go for it.
so that once everybody forgets the person who died, that person is finally released to be reborn or whatever. It goes a little bit with the bodhisattva idea of the bodhisattva being the being that hangs around, could be transported to nirvana, but hangs around in order to help those who are still on earth. There's a little connection there.
there are some other things too that Judy Burling talked about just a little bit in her book. And you see this in Taiwan, which is where she did her research, of course. It's probably breaking down a little bit more now, but we've just come through 2 years of COVID. And she said in folk communities in Taiwan, a temple would get together and say, okay, we've just had some calamity here. We need a purification ritual. We need to reset the community. And they bring in people and they do the stuff and it's kind of like, okay, let's have a new start here. And then another one is she said, communities that would have multiple temples to different gods and so forth. And they would have, like we have a Christian calendar, they would have a calendar where all the temples would have a festival every few weeks throughout the year. And it doesn't matter if they're Buddhist, they're Taoist. A lot of the times you can't tell what gods are what in these temples. Even the priests in the temple may not know who they are. What, are these Buddhists? Where do they come from? I don't know. They're here. Let's celebrate. So
that reminds me of a story I wanted to tell on the very first night, but I knew it's a funny, not funny story, but it's too good not to tell. In my last job, I had some coworkers who were born in India and were very Indian. And I assume practiced some form of Hinduism. I didn't get into the religion too much. It's like one was a vegetarian, one wasn't. So I don't know, I didn't learn a lot, but when there was a woman in her 30s with a couple of kids and husband, and they were kind of trying to live out the American dream, and we're moving from one house in Beaverton to another house in Beaverton. And our boss said, well, Selva's taking a few days off because she's getting ready for the blessing of the house ceremony. And this came across as a very superstitious thing. And moving into a new home, it's not good enough to have a housewarming. They had to have all the relatives and everybody come, and they had to have this big event. And so she had to take a few days off work to set up for this ceremony that was going to bring their new house good luck. And it was part of the family tradition. And then a couple of days later, my boss said, Selva's going to be out for a couple more weeks. Well, what happened? Well, in the course of, cleaning her new house and getting it all ready for this blessing for good luck, she fell and broke her arm.
Mm.
So, like I say, it's funny, but it's not funny. But
Yeah.
It's what I it's one of the things I think of when I think about superstition and religion.
It's like the accidents of people falling off a ladder when they're putting up their Christmas lights.
Yes.
Kind of like that, yeah. 'Tis the season.
Sorry.
Well, I think that's a perfect ending.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, good luck, everyone. Don't hurt yourself turning off your
Right.
computers.
Right.
Now watch out for our announcements.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Watch out for our religion.
Thank you, Joanne. Very interesting.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Joanne.
Joanne. Yes.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you.